to me, you leave, you start a gallery, and then you legitimize that gallery. And joining AIPAD was kind of that big notch on my belt as, oh, I'm really doing this. Like, I'm an art dealer. I'm part of this association now.
That was Michael Hulett telling me about leaving Peter Fetterman Gallery to open the Hulett Collection, and how for him, receiving associate membership to AIPAD was true recognition of his legitimacy as a photography dealer. I'm also joined today by Douglas Marshall of the Marshall Gallery, who actually hired Michael when he was director of Peter Fetterman Gallery, and was also part of AIPAD's associate membership pilot program, which among other things we'll be discussing today in episode 5 of my 7-part collaborative series with AIPAD in the lead up to the 2025 edition of the Photography Show, the oldest and longest running art fair for photography, which will take place from the 23rd until the 27th of April at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City. Throughout April, I'll be speaking with AIPAD members, both past and present, about the history of the organisation and how the market for photography has grown and evolved over the past 50 years. My guests today are the aforementioned Douglas Marshall and Michael Hulett, alumni of LA's Peter Fetterman Gallery, and represent the next generation of photography dealers and AIPAD members. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the program. You're listening to Subtext Discourse Art World podcast, highlighting unique perspectives on contemporary art and photography. I'm your host, Michael Dooney. Now, without further ado, please enjoy our conversation. Maybe just to begin with, we can have like a quick introduction, just say how you started, what your introduction to photography was. Douglas, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in Texas and went to the university there in Austin and studied photography and wanted to be a photographer. And since early teenage years, have kind of been carrying a camera and been in the darkroom. Did that all through university and several years out of university, but found it, incredibly difficult in the sort of housing recession timeframe of 2008, 2009 to come even close to making a living as a photographer. And at the time was producing small exhibitions with friends and just started to naturally move into the role of working in galleries, and worked at a gallery in Austin, and then moved out to LA in 2011 and have worked in a number of galleries since then before opening my own space about 4 years ago. So took the kind of path from photographer to gallerist, but definitely as a photographer in the beginning.
And how about you, Michael?
I did not have as structured of a path. I had the idea for most of my life that I was going to be an attorney because I come from a line of lawyers. And in college years, I met a girl who was super into photography, and we dated for quite a long time. And though that relationship ended, my love for photography had kind of picked up while we were dating, and that didn't go away. So whenever I met my wife, when we were in our 20s, she was moving to LA to go to makeup school. I was a photographer here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I'm from, which Doug and I realized early on that we were neighbors in terms of, the US. He grew up in Dallas. I grew up in Tulsa. So we were essentially from the same place in the Midwest. I moved to LA, was a photographer there, hated it, put down the camera for many years, got a job at an art gallery at Bergamot Station where Peter Fetterman is, because I thought that would be more stable for some reason. I don't know why. And after a year there, I found out that Fetterman was hiring, and Douglas hired me as the registrar. And this was 2013.
Oh, so Douglas hired you?
Yeah, Douglas was the director at Fetterman and hired me. And then as he made his leave, I kind of moved into his place. And then fast forward, I was the director there until 2022. And my wife and I were on the verge of having our second kid. And we didn't want to spend $2 million on a bungalow in the valley. So we bought a house in our hometown, and I had been collecting feverishly while working there because we were both working professionals without kids and had income. And Peter is a very addictive collector and kind of imbued that into me. And so by the time I left, I had close to 2,000 works in my personal collection, wow, which then became the gallery's inventory, the gallery's holdings whenever we moved back here. But I had no plans to become a gallerist. I just don't have other life skills. I don't want to be a photographer, and I had been doing this for so long, and I had the inventory already. So here we are.
Yeah, wow. How did you both pick to go to LA? Because I suppose from the outside, we always see New York as the center of the universe.
I mean, for myself, I imagine it's similar, just coming from Texas, specifically for myself, coming from Austin. LA just seemed like a more natural fit. I had a lot of friends who moved to Los Angeles and after college and would visit, and was also visiting New York City, and just I don't know. It was twofold of that. LA seemed a more fun place to go and less like grueling as a young person. Like you really in New York, you're gonna have to grind in either place, but at least here when you're grinding it out in your 20s, the weather's beautiful, the beach is 5 minutes away. There's just certain perks that make it a little easier to bear those early years of struggle. And also that LA was clearly on the rise in the art world to challenge or at least match New York's kind of stranglehold on the art world. And so it seemed more exciting to go someplace where there was things happening and room to grow than to just try and jump into the traditional lines then.
Well, and for me, I mean, I followed a girl to LA. I had been to LA once, I had been to New York once. I honestly did not really like either of them. Definitely after living in LA and after having worked in New York for the last decade plus, I would pick LA every single time over New York. It's a different vibe, it's a different energy.
And how does it compare for both of you? You said you're from the Midwest, is that right?
Midwest, South.
South,
It's a blurry line between
depends
the
on
South,
who you
but,
ask.
Okay.
I think if I tell people from Alabama that I'm from the South, coming from Austin, they laugh at me, but technically still considered the South, I suppose. But
You could say we're from God's country.
yeah, that's true.
Nobody
Flyover
should,
country.
but you can.
I don't know. I had plenty of art school friends and colleagues who left Texas and went to New York City, and many of whom are still there. And I think it's just a personal choice of what kind of, yeah, they definitely have different vibes as cities and different lifestyles. And I think people just naturally gravitate to one or the other. I always say, like, I love to visit New York for a week, and that's plenty for me. That's the cliche of the weather in LA that brings people here, and it's true. And it keeps a lot of us here, despite the cost of living and all the other factors. But I don't know. I definitely think that as far as any role that the Midwest might play or growing up in the central part of the States is that there's just no art market in the middle of the country, or very little. I mean, Dallas is like challenging to become a serious art market, and Houston as well. Houston's about to host, one of the Untitled art fairs. But yeah, I think you just realize, okay, there's not much you can do. You just can't go very far because, when I was living in Austin, there was five or less, or, maybe five galleries that were active of varying quality. And in Dallas, something not too far off from that. So compared to several, hundred pushing 1,000 in LA and New York City. So it just, I think for same thing, if you grew up in the Midwest and you wanted to be a musician or an actor or comedian or something, there's only so far you can go in those places. There's just New York and LA just presents a whole new landscape of collaborators and potential and jobs.
Yeah. So how did you both end up, well, at different points, but how did you choose Peter Fetterman Gallery? How do you explain his kind of presence in LA and the US?
Well, I mean, I guess if I started there first, I might jump on it. I mean, Peter definitely, he's been in business, I don't know, 35, pushing 40 years
Since
now.
88.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And he was one of the founding galleries here at Bergamot Station, which is a complex, for those who don't know, a complex of about 15 galleries in Santa Monica. And he was one of the founding galleries in 1994. And myself, it's not too far off from Mike's story. I was working at another gallery, sort of across the road from this complex. It was a major contemporary blue chip gallery that somehow I managed to get a job in, and moved to LA originally for that job. And after a year there, I just was having lunch at a cafe that's next to Peter's gallery. And I was, living and breathing photography. And so I would go see his exhibitions, and I just asked, "Are you hiring?" And sure enough, they were. And I started the next week. So yeah, it was a similar thing where I was at a gallery. I had got this gallery job for a year. And then, yeah, I guess I was there for about a year before I moved into the director role. Pretty young. I was probably 24, 25 years, maybe 25 years old. Then, I don't know, a year or so later, Mike walked in. Though I don't know, Mike, that we ever actually talked in the parking lot or anything while you were at Patrick's gallery.
No, we never did. Kate introduced us. So I was at
yeah.
a gallery that was, I don't even know how to put this politely. It was run by a bit of a megalomaniac, and like from within the first month, I was looking for another job, but I also have this like the boomer side of my brain always wants to be somewhere for at least a year. Like I don't want to just leave after 2 months because it looks bad. And so I stuck it out for a year, and everyone there was kind of looking to jump ship. And so anytime any of us heard about a job opportunity, we told the rest. And so the director at the gallery said, "Hey, Peter Fetterman's hiring." And I don't know how, like, at what point this started, but at some point, Peter had started dealing with more contemporary artists and started housing inventory of larger prints, contemporary prints that were framed. And I think that that was the reason it necessitated having male figures around to carry the frames. I mean, this all sounds really, really, really weird and sexist. But anyway, by the time I came around, it was a boys' club at Fetterman. Like, and it had been a boys' club for a while. A woman hadn't worked there in like 10 or 15 years. And it was just a weird line of males going through there that would be registrar, assistant director, director. And so, yeah, that was the path I took.
And I wouldn't, just to
Yeah,
protect
please
Peter.
clean up what I'm saying.
So just to protect Peter's reputation, he had actually all women on staff for many years, the first decade or so of the gallery. And I don't know when it started to become, to where it did become kind of a lineage, a guys club there for a while. But, when we were hiring, because I think it's the structure that Peter, to his credit, is somebody who really just values hard work and honesty. He doesn't, he's not impressed by MFAs or art history degrees or, who or where. I mean, he respects hard work. And I think how that translates is that people just climb the ladder there. And so including myself, I started in the back room doing registrar work when I first started for a year or so. And then the director left and the assistant director moved up and I moved up and then he left and so on. And so it was always this ladder where whenever we were hiring, we were basically hiring for the back room, which did require, and we would show people when they would come to interview, like, you have to be able to lift these 50-pound boxes of matted large prints up to high shelves and stuff. And it's a physically demanding position. And I think it's because we were always hiring for that role. And we would really stress, like, this is a sweaty job. You're going to smash your fingers. It wasn't that, there was any requirements of one way or the other. Just, I think it weeded out certain people who were like, this is not what I want out of a gallery job.
I will say that I broke the streak. My successor that I hired is female.
But did she work in the back room?
Ish.
She could, though. She's a very tough cookie for sure. She totally could. Anyways, Peter, one of the great things working with him is in that testament to just respecting hard work is that he would give us a lot of responsibility really early on. I mean, I went to the first art fair with him, I don't know, 3 months after I started, which was an enormous amount of responsibility for a 24-year-old to shepherd an art fair, his biggest art fair in New York City, which is called the Winter Antiques Fair. In terms of like its length and it's the amount of inventory that we send for that show, it's a very large production. But very quickly, started going to the AIPAD photography show. And I think once you're in that world, once you visit the AIPAD show, which, once Mike started going to these shows as well, then you're really just like totally in this amazing community of photography and surrounded by, this world. And then you really see how deep and nuanced the photographic medium is in a fine art sense, where we have a very, the photography world is still kind of its own bubble, for better or worse. And we still have our own fairs and our own festivals. And AIPAD is, the real celebration of that community, at least in the States. I don't know how long Peter's been a member there, but it's got to be decades. But, we were doing, including the AIPAD show, doing, 6 or 8 fairs a year all over the world, which we would then start to, because we were doing so many, we would delegate to different staff members, including myself and Mike. But I don't know, when did you first go to AIPAD, Mike?
I first went to AIPAD in 2018, I think. I didn't do AIPAD for a while. That was like the big boy. That was yeah, exactly. And that was the beauty of having seniority at the gallery. You got to cherry pick the fairs you wanted to go to. And Douglas kept AIPAD all to himself for a long time. But it's the big leagues, Yeah.
And it's fun. It's a fun show to be at. It's shorter than a lot of the other fairs, or at least at the time it was compared to the other fairs we were doing. And you just saw, if you're somebody who lives and breathes photography, when you go to that fair, you just look around and it's like, there's that artist and there's that, legendary collector and there's that legendary curator. And it's just, so when you're in that world versus going to the other fairs in Miami or, London or other, especially non-photo focused fairs, then, it's a different, it feels very like business centric. And AIPAD's a great business fair as well, but it's just also feels like this really great community that is, you get to experience whether you're a visitor or you're working.
Well, and yeah, you realize just how small the art world is and how even smaller the photography world is beyond that. And everybody in it is fantastic. And I think Peter, as much as like we joke about things that happen there, I just want to say that as a testament to Peter, well, not including the director before Douglas, who now runs another prominent photo gallery, the director before him, who had his own gallery. Douglas and I are two of the newest AIPAD members, and we are, Peter's offspring. So I
Yeah.
think that says a lot about the quality of person that he hires and his leadership abilities.
Yeah, well, it sounds like his gallery was a real, almost like a training ground for future gallerists, particularly if you guys started like on the ground floor, literally in the back room, lifting things and moving stuff around. Like you've been part of every stage of the process. You're not just coming in and taking over the front desk or doing something like that. You're handling every aspect of running a gallery, really.
Yeah, I never thought about that. That's probably a true point as to why so many of his staff do feel at least confident enough to open their own gallery, is because they have run every aspect and you're like, oh, well, I've covered all the ground that I think is necessary. Of course, you get a very big slap in the face once you're in control of the bank accounts and the credit cards. It's a very different ball game once that's, and the tax appointments and the business licenses and all the stuff that you didn't see when you were, or just the, very difficult first 5 years of any business that, Peter weathered long ago. But yeah, I mean, the director that hired me is a curator at a museum here in Southern California. One of the other directors before him is a director at another gallery here in LA. So, he's really, a lot of people work in galleries and then maybe move into other fields, or certainly, young gallerists leaving and opening their own gallery is not unheard of. But I do think Peter has really cultivated a passion. I mean, he really is somebody who's just deeply, deeply obsessed with the medium of photography and is really good at sharing that, both with employees and collectors and staff. And so, yeah, I think he kind of showed us that it's possible to make a living celebrating this medium if you are willing to work hard enough for it. And he is certainly somebody who works very hard. But Mike and I guess we were there together for about 3 years. I mean, we had a real great golden period where it was the two of us and two other staff members, and we were all like super close friends and would hang out on the weekends and take trips together, go camping, go to Dodgers games. I mean, there was a real great period for a couple years, where we had this very tight staff, and it made work like fun. It made work going to work fun, and like we were all really, there was not any complaining about toes being stepped on, or everyone kind of knew their role, and we all had mutual respect. And so that was a really nice period. But as far as for myself, come 2017, I've been there 5 or 6 years, and I just started to, I don't know, it's probably the millennial in me of just sort of not being able to sit still, and always kind of in a bit of ambition. And my father was always owned his own business, and so I always had this hope that I would, be able to have my own business, and started to have ideas about leaving the gallery to try and do my own thing. And I felt, that it was in a really good position because Mike and I and Zach and David and other people that worked there, we really worked really hard to get the gallery's branding in order, the storage, the inventory. I mean, we really tried to like tighten the ship up over several years, and I think we did a really good job. And at a certain point, I felt like it was in really good hands with Mike and the other staff, and the gallery was in a good position as far as organization and efficiency. And I just started to have a lot of artists that I was talking with who were very supportive of the idea of working with me were I to start my own endeavor. And it just took a bit of time to get up that courage. I wish I had taken a little more time and maybe built up some savings, but I decided to jump ship, and through a few short-term roles, contract positions, I started to launch the program around 2018, 2019, and then really tried to jump in early 2020, only to be, blindsided by the pandemic. And
Yeah.
just put sort of, I think in a way it was a blessing that it gave me this really long runway to get things going through 2020 without much, expense going out. I was able to just start building a social media following, doing virtual talks and virtual exhibitions, and, doing the Zoom thing. And I think that year sort of gave me a good time to just build the brand before I opened the first brick and mortar space in January 2021, and was in a space for about 9 months in Venice Beach before moving to the current space in Santa Monica. But Mike, what about you? How did you plan your exit?
Well, what I did, I started by watching everything you did. I was taking notes. I was like, all right, he left. He didn't have enough money. I should get more money. But no, I really, I mean, I've used Doug as a sounding board throughout this whole process. But like I said, I had been with Peter from 2013. It was 2022. We were coming out of pandemic. AIPAD was going to have, its first in-person rendition since the pandemic was going. And my wife and I just decided that it was time for us to leave LA. So it wasn't so much about leaving Peter, but a part of me thought I've done what I could do there. There's not much more growth for me in that position, and it was time to pass the torch on to a new, younger crew. So, in my kind of existential search for what I was going to do when we left and moved home, I was talking to museums here in Tulsa. I was looking at other galleries, and my wife said, well, you have all those photos in boxes in the closet and under the bed and in the attic. So why don't you maybe try selling those? And then when you're out of them, then we'll figure out something else. And so thus my gallery was born out of necessity, essentially. Necessity and want. So when we decided to make our jump, I actually gave Peter a 1 year notice and hired all the new crew. And then AIPAD 2022 was the last thing I did with Peter under his gallery. And then 2023, I was one of the first associate members of AIPAD, which that was kind of, to me, you leave, you start a gallery, and then you legitimize that gallery. And joining AIPAD was kind of that big like notch on my belt, as in terms of, oh, I'm really doing this. Like I'm an art dealer. I'm part of this association now.
Yeah. So, what is the associate membership of AIPAD?
So the associate membership is something that they came up with. I think 2023 was the first year they offered it, where you have a full member, which everybody in AIPAD up until that point had been full members, and it had for a burgeoning gallery that didn't have a big bank account, the price that it cost to get in initially was steep to me. I didn't have that kind of money, so they came up with a system with an associate membership where you still have access to all the perks that AIPAD members have. You can still apply and exhibit at the fair. You still have access to all the resources. It is a smaller fee to initiate your membership and to pay yearly, and you gain the same access. And then that goes on for 2 years. And that basically gives you this, like Douglas had with COVID, it gives you this nice long runway to get into your full membership, where you're not just coming right out the gate having to spend what to me was a large sum of money to join the group.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that it was brilliant for them to come up with that, because honestly, I probably would not have been able to join until maybe this year or next year otherwise.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
How has the change been then, leaving Los Angeles and going back to Tulsa? Because I suppose Douglas sort of touched on it before, that let's say the opportunities aren't as broad.
Yeah, there's one could say that there's no photo market here, and one would be accurate in saying that. Part of what I wanted to do was to really kind of sense ideal in two-dimensional art. And since the internet exists and I have a good social media presence, and so I still sell to kind of all corners of the world. I had started online with my gallery before I even left LA just to test the waters. And so I was able to sell just having a website, just having an Instagram presence, and doing newsletter blasts and slowly growing my following. And so that gave me confidence to be able to come here to Tulsa, have very little overhead in terms of, my gallery is, I pay $1 a square foot for it, which you don't get that anywhere else on either coast.
Yeah.
And, in 2.5 hours, I can be in LA or I can be in New York, and I can go where I need to go. I can do the fairs I need to do. And then I have an efficient and affordable home base to come back to. So it's going to be a long uphill road to create any kind of real photo market here in my hometown, which I've been working on. I do workshops on collecting and trying to explain to people, just trying to pass on knowledge about why what I have on the walls is important and why it should be in a collection. But that's like a 5 to 10 year long-term project I'm working on here. But I do quite a few pop-ups in LA and New York to keep my presence known in those markets. So I show up in one city or the other every 2 to 3 months and do something there,
Oh,
whether
wow.
that's an art fair or a private pop-up that I do.
Do you think that's still essential for you to kind of stay relevant?
Absolutely. You know, the more and more that the internet plays such a big part in the art buying process, whether it's people buying at auction or people buying through e-commerce, the more access people have to all these things. It's not about, oh, I know the gallerist that represents that artist, so I can get whatever. Anybody can get anything. Everybody sees the prices both on the primary and secondary market everywhere. Everyone has access to that information. So I think it's important for me to establish those interpersonal relationships with clients. They can buy an Elliot Erwitt from 20 different galleries. Why would they buy it from me? They buy it from me because they like me, because they want to deal with me. And so that's why I host those things in those markets, so that people get to know me.
Yeah, interesting. Because, yeah, you're right. It's particularly because you deal a lot with classical photography, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no shortage of outlets to kind of get your hands on that sort of work. So
Yeah, exactly.
it really emphasizes the role of the dealer, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, and luckily for me, I don't think that there's a ton of people under the age of 50 dealing, opening galleries and dealing in classic photography. And there's probably a good reason behind that, not one that I'm going to pay attention to. But the nice thing is that I think, there's a whole demographic of collectors that their parents were collectors and kind of passed that gene onto them. They're not in their 30s, but they're not in their 70s either. And so they're maybe looking for younger energy to work with. And that's where I come in.
Yeah. Have you done AIPAD yet as your own gallery?
I have. Last year I did AIPAD as an associate member, as my last year of associate membership. And actually I convinced Douglas to come on as an associate member. I think he was wanting to anyway. But then we did a shared booth together.
Oh, cool.
Because just in case people didn't think we were already connected at the hip on everything, including this podcast that we're doing together, we went ahead and shared a booth, which was actually fantastic.
Well, it's also just practical. I mean, for a lot of people, I tell my friends and family and stuff that a lot of people don't realize how very expensive the art fairs are to participate in. Incredibly expensive, especially for young businesses. And so the practicality of sharing a booth for young galleries is becoming more and more common. We're seeing it more at other fairs as well. Because the art fairs are so crucial to the awareness of your gallery and the growth of your gallery that you really do need to be there, especially in the early days, to kind of, as you were saying earlier, like legitimize the operation. It just adds a lot of credibility, but also just awareness and meeting collectors and curators and things. And it's great to be there, but it's a huge overhead, and so splitting it. But then also, Mike and I we both have, I think, one part-time employee, and so when we're at the fair, you got to obviously step away from the booth from time to time for various reasons, and we both know each other's inventory and artists more or less, pretty well, and so we would be able to kind of cover the whole booth when one person would step away for lunch or something, and it was also just made it like, even if we bust out and we don't sell a thing, we'll have a really good time.
And that's exactly what it was.
Was last year your first fair as well as your independent gallery?
It was my first AIPAD fair, yes, but I've done a few other fairs prior to that.
How is it going to AIPAD as Douglas Marshall Gallery?
It's great. I mean, because I'd done that show so many times with Peter, and so much of the photo community and collecting community, whether they're based in LA or Miami or New York, or everyone kind of meets at that show, and it was a great experience. Sales, business wise, was good, and the energy was really good last year. And I think for the first few fairs I did on my own, I went in there very stressed and under pressure and feeling like, okay, we gotta, this pressure to sell, because it is so much of a upfront investment to do the fairs. And I think with AIPAD, it's just more relaxing because it's just such a familiar territory and familiar faces that you could go into it with a little more ease. And I'd known from doing many, many fairs with Peter, including AIPAD, that AIPAD was one of the strongest fairs as far as sales, and that the photo community that buys goes to that show. And so I was pretty optimistic, as I am this year, that sales would be good, and I think that was borne out. So it's nice when you just have kind of a smaller booth and you don't have to take as much inventory. With Peter, we would take huge amounts of inventory that was weeks of preparation, and Mike and I keep it a little more minimal for now, at least. But yeah, it was great. The other fairs were like smaller photo fairs or small photo fairs here in California or in Paris. But I think AIPAD was kind of my first bigger fair. Oh no, I'm sorry, I did Paris photo prior to that. But yeah, it was great.
As we're already on the topic, this episode is brought to you by AIPAD and the Photography Show. AIPAD represents fine art photography galleries around the world and is proud to present the 2025 edition of its flagship event, the Photography Show. The fair will showcase photography from the earliest processes to cutting-edge contemporary work that pushes the boundaries of the medium. From April 23 until 27 at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City, go to www.aipad.com/show for more information and to plan your visit. And Michael was saying before, he deals still with classics. Are you also working with kind of heritage photography, or do you have some contemporary artists on your roster?
No, I think that's probably the place where Mike and I diverge the most. I mean, I do have a bit, though that's mostly through third-party collectors. I was never and still am not a collector myself. It's been from a practical standpoint of finances, but also just the collection that I do have, or, I've purchased a handful of things over the years, but most of it are gifts from artists that I've worked with, or trades or things like that. But no, when I started the gallery, Marshall Gallery, I really set out to focus in what I mostly refer to as process-based or process-focused photographic art. So work that really bears the craftsmanship and the hand of the artist, whether that's just traditional darkroom analog printing that is really this craftsman approach to the photographic medium, all the way to the artists that are really blurring the boundary between what is photography, what is sculpture, what is painting, because of how they approach the photographic process, whether through photochemical manipulation or burning prints, weaving things, collage. I've always really enjoyed the photographic object, whether that's just a beautiful print or something that has layers and textures and mixed media to it. And I started to see that artists were the amount of that kind of work that was being made, especially as I started to go to fairs in Europe with Peter. I started to see more and more artists who were working in that approach. And I saw very few galleries who were showing that kind of work. And so I sort of set out in order for the gallery to kind of have its own lane to focus in this experimental contemporary work, which is still the case today, though I do have a number of photographers on my roster who are traditional, documentary approach photographers who make silver gelatin prints, inkjet prints. But I'd say 3/4 of my roster and my attention goes to focusing on mixed media and experimental approaches, oftentimes cameraless photochemical pieces. And I love it when someone comes into the gallery and asks me, "Is that photography?" And I love that question. And I always just say, you tell me. I don't know. That's kind of what the boundaries that we're trying to investigate, because photography is still this siloed medium, is still kind of I refer to as the bastard medium of the art world. And a lot of that's self-inflicted by the photographic community. But I didn't notice doing art fairs outside of the photo fairs, that a lot of collectors were still very apprehensive to collect contemporary photography because they didn't like the editions and large editions. And editions in photography have gotten smaller and smaller to almost being non-existent now. But say 10, 15 years ago, a lot of collectors of paintings or sculptures, aside from household names or the Avedons and the Pins of the world, they seem to be reluctant to collect younger artists who were making editioned works. And I thought that perhaps focusing on artists who are making pieces that were unique because of how they were made, one of a kind, that might be an interesting way to bridge the contemporary art world and the photography world, and still trying to answer that question.
Do you work with any living artists, Michael?
I do. Even though my emphasis and my love for photography is kind of born out of post-war humanist figurative work, sadly, a lot of those artists are no longer with us, or with us for now, for the moment, but soon to be gone. And there's going to be a finite amount of that work to deal in. So to keep the gallery moving forward, I've been going out and slowly but surely finding my own roster of contemporary and emerging artists to work with. Unlike Douglas, most of my artists they're either reportage, documentarians, or just realist in terms of the artwork that they create.
They look like photographs.
Yeah, exactly. Straight photography. Can't go wrong with it.
Yeah, and same thing. I also do. My whole back room of the gallery right now is all vintage photography, mostly post-war American works, and several in the gallery. So almost a lot of the shows here that I've done here, they focus on the contemporary artist, and that's the main kind of point of the exhibition. But I usually am bringing in vintage work to be in dialogue with that work through conceptual approach or technical approach or subject matter. And I think in the early days, I thought that doing that was a way that I would be able to get the classic collectors of photography to come through the doors and at least hear me out about this weird abstract stuff that was on the walls in the main gallery. If I could sort of show that I knew what I was talking about of the world that they were familiar with. And it's become more so that I still just, love the history of photography. And, until moving to LA, photography for me was only the world of Magnum. It was all about black and white, street, documentary, Cartier-Bresson, Irwit, Salgado, so on and so on. That was photography. And as I started to travel more international and see what photography was to other people, or even within Peter's gallery, starting to show works like from the era of pictorialism and the early quarter of the 20th century that was emulating painting and were on these really beautiful textural papers. Even then, you saw this object as this really special. Yes, there might be a few copies of this print, but this one is really unique and special because of the type of paper or something. So it became for me just an obsession with valuing the individual object of a photograph. And as far as what I show in the gallery and exhibit, and less so about the image itself, or not discarding the image, but just giving equal importance to how it's made physically as an object. I don't sell many books. I don't sell NFTs. I sell physical things that you can hold in your hands. And a lot of that was inspired by some of the artists that I first started working with, especially the Spanish duo Albarrán Cabrera, who really were instrumental in my early days as starting the gallery and valuing the print as an object, and a lot of hours spent talking philosophically about photography and what it means to us kind of steered that path. But I still just love the medium and love going to AIPAD and walking around and seeing, all the amazing different genres and periods of photography, from very early Carlton Watkins landscapes to Mahalinaj experimental pieces to, so on and so forth. So, I kind of picked a lane as far as the early days of the gallery, but I think I just ended up going with Marshall Gallery because I wanted it to be something that could be fluid. So you could talk to me in 10 years and I might be showing all oil paintings. I don't know. But, just kind of following your taste and following your passion. And right now, I'm just personally really excited about all the experimental work that is being made that I think is sort of a subconscious pushback against the ubiquity of digital images and the billions of images we consume daily, that artists just working today really wanted to get their hands dirty and get away from the computer, get away from Lightroom and Photoshop, and just spend more time making objects with their hands. I certainly feel that way, and I think a lot of the artists I work with feel that way, and so I trying to continue that focus for now.
Do you think with your collector base and your clients, it's also seeing a kind of return to that? Because if I reflect on speaking to some of the, let's say, the older generation of AIPAD members, there was definitely an emphasis on the object of photography and like the quality of the print and how it was made and where it was made. And it wasn't just the picture itself, it was what the picture was, let's say it was contained on. And you working with experimental works and I guess with processes, it does bring the attention back to the actual object of photography. And are you seeing maybe more appreciation for that in the sort of digital age, that people want to get away from their screens and really appreciate like the thingness of photographs?
I think so, but it might also just be because of the conversation I've been having around my gallery and with people for the last 5 years, that the people who are into that have sort of gravitated to my orbit. But no, I do think it's borne out. You can just look at the market. I mean, if when you used to go to AIPAD 5 or 10 years ago, it was almost entirely, traditional photography, what the average person would say, yeah, that's photography. And now you see a lot of experimental mixed media work. So clearly the gallerists are responding to what the artists are doing and what collectors are interested in. And I think that, the collectors now are our generation, or will be very soon. And so they are, older millennials who are pushing back against a life in front of computer screens and are wanting things that are novel and physical and experimental. Last year, I took experimental contemporary stuff and some classics, and I did much better with my contemporary experimental work at AIPAD than I did with my classic work. So I was nervous about that because some of the stuff I took was kind of out there. I mean, one of them was a long exposure of drug traffickers through a very long-winded, process, very impressive artwork by Alex Turner. And we sold 3 copies at the fair. And I was like, I don't know if anyone's going to buy this at a fair in New York City, a picture of drug smugglers. That seems like a long stretch, but, people really responded to, it wasn't just that it was a picture that contained that, it was this long process that he went through to get that I think they respected and appreciated. So no, I think people are responding to that. There are definitely plenty of collectors I know who come in and see the abstract, some show I have, and they're not interested at all. They're only, let me know when you get some blue chip vintage stuff in. And I totally get that. But I think there's a bigger market for, well, yeah, I mean, it's got to be true that there's probably overall a bigger market for what can be called quote unquote art than fine art photography. Fine art photography is just a narrow, portion of that. And so I think once you're, working and dealing works or exhibiting works that blur the boundaries, then you just cast a wider net. And, now instead of doing Paris Photo, I'm doing the fairs in Miami, which are, contemporary art focused, very, very little photography in them. But for me, I want to kind of have sort of a foot in both parties, as it were. And I don't know, I definitely, though, you do see collectors who are collectors of quote unquote straight photography, who also have that respect for the object. And some of the pieces we're taking to AIPAD this year are vintage pieces by iconic, straight photographers, Friedlander, Winogrand, etc., we're showing them because they have some special quality to how they are as a physical object. They're mounted on some unique board, or they have a certain special inscription on them, or something is unique about that one copy. And definitely for the people at the top, tier of collecting classic fine art photography, certainly they still value provenance and condition and the aspects that do make that one print, unique. I think where that starts to break down is maybe at the more entry level price point, where you're dealing more with people who are just kind of wanting to put something over the green couch, as Peter would say. Who are just, they just love a fun picture. They are nostalgic for the past, and they don't really care about how many copies there are, or the provenance, or if this is a modern print versus a vintage print. They just love the image, and that's totally fine. That's that's what they have time for and their interest, and they've got other interests, and then obsessing over provenance of prints like we have to. And so there's a market for that as well, and we're happy for that.
Well, I suppose that's always a good entry point for people, isn't it? You discover the photography, you get into the imagery, and then some people are happy with that, but then other people, they do want to go deeper.
Yeah, as I suppose collecting anything else. If you collecting motorcycles or baseball cards, at first you get what's in your orbit, and then as you really commit time to it, you start to kind of become a connoisseur and a wine or whatever. And certainly AIPAD is the show that connoisseurs of photography in the States go to, because that's where you're going to see, the galleries are bringing the best of what they have to offer. And there's always this, I love seeing all the previews that come out for the fairs, because you kind of see what people are most excited, like their sort of showcase piece that they lead their email with, or something like that, where through some collector, they found some vintage gem or some contemporary artist that is, really hitting a stride or something like that. So I encourage, I do a lot of private consulting with emerging artists, and I'm always encouraging them, if they're in the States and they have the means, to go to AIPAD, because that's where you're going to really get your finger on the pulse of the current contemporary photography market. You're going to see what type of work is being shown, what type of work is selling, how it's being framed, how it's priced, how people are doing editions. You really, as I always tell them, don't go there to try and show your own work, but go there to take a notepad and collect some business cards and do the research, just because that's where you're going to see, those are the spearhead of the market. And that's where you're going to see the most kind of current trends, as it were. I hate that word, but yeah, the current kind of pulse of things.
Well, it's true. There's no other art fair that takes place in the U.S. that is photography focused that comes anywhere close to the caliber of what you see shown at AIPAD and the exhibitors that come out to participate there. And I think a huge move that they made was going back to the Armory, which happened last year and will continue this year, just because it's such a esteemed historic venue that is, you're on the Upper East Side. It's where the fair used to take place years ago, and now it's back. So, yeah, I think that AIPAD has established itself as the leading fair in the U.S. and probably in the world for photography.
Yeah, and I think they've taken a really great new direction in the last few years. I say this lovingly, that AIPAD started to garner a reputation of kind of being an old boys club of these veteran dealers showing black and white photography and all beautiful things. But there started to be a conversation a number of years ago that the show was sort of not progressing. And I think a lot of that was COVID, and things, for everybody just got muddy for a while, and politics and global politics, but that it needed kind of a new energy. It was also sort of bouncing around to different venues around New York City, so it sort of wasn't finding its home. And as Michael said, that being back at the Armory really felt like being back home. I mean, that was it. If it had not moved back to the Armory, I'm not sure I would have been in the fair last year. I think that was a really crucial, expensive for everybody, but a crucial move. It's the same thing when Paris Photo was out of the Grand Palais for several years. It was still a nice show, but you just associate Paris Photo with the Grand Palais. You associate AIPAD with the Armory. It's just these beautiful historic venues that just add so much charm to the experience of going. And fortunately, over the last few years, the organization has brought in or sort of refreshed its leadership. I think all of the predecessors and previous presidents and directors have all left their stamp, and in all good ways. I mean, the fair has always grown and grown and grown, but I think they were wise and were aware that it was kind of time for a refresh of maybe a new energy, bringing some international voices into the leadership and bringing on a new director and I think it's in a really great place right now. I'm really excited to be back there in a few weeks. I think the current leadership has the right vision for the future. They're really good at balancing the expectations and the demands of our predecessors, who can be a cranky old bunch and very demanding. And Lydia and her whole team are really great at balancing the traditions of AIPAD, the expectations of this renowned fair, but also with knowing that you've got to kind of stay current. You have to speak to current directions in the art world and the cultural world at large. And so I think they have their vision of where the fair needs to grow and spend some more energy focusing on kind of the future, whether that's experimental work or artificial intelligence work or whatever comes in the next 5 to 10 years, knowing that photography is an ever evolving medium and the fair has to evolve with it. It can't just kind of stay stuck in showing post-war black and white photography. It's really got to celebrate new practices. It has to celebrate unseen voices or unheard voices from the past, artists who didn't get their due at their time and their age. And photography is a medium that, like a lot of art history, is the attention has mostly been on one demographic of people for centuries, and we're now getting a more broad look at the history of the medium that is more nuanced and more focused on underrepresented voices. And I think the new direction of the fair is really making space for that and bringing in more international galleries, more international artists, which makes for just a much more exciting fair. And I think the new collectors really want that. They want to see what work is coming from Australia, what work's coming from India, what work's coming from China. And whether it's contemporary or vintage, it's just, there's such a bigger world than kind of what the American market had a taste for a while. And I think the new leadership is really taking the fair in an exciting, not like a huge shift or anything, but it's subtle, but it's aware and sensitive to bigger discussions. So I think, it's going to be an exciting show this year.
It was great speaking with Douglas and Michael about their paths to the world of fine art photography, their shared experiences at Peter Fetterman Gallery, and going on to open their own photography galleries. Links to both the Marshall Gallery and the Hulett Collection are included in the show notes, together with details of the Association of International Photography Art Dealers. In the next episode of the series, I'll be speaking with Bruce Silverstein, the passionate photography collector who at 30 years of age left his lucrative Wall Street career to focus exclusively on his lifelong dedication to photography. If you want to be the first to hear new episodes, please subscribe to Subtext Discourse Art World podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you know someone else interested in the overlap of photography in the art world, please send them a link to the show. Podcasting is obviously a broadcast medium, however I'm happy for listeners to reach out. You're welcome to follow me on Threads, Instagram, Blue Sky and LinkedIn at Michael Dooney. Otherwise, you can go to my website, www.michaeldooney.net. There you'll also find the International Photo Festival database I put together, as well as my webinar for photographers and artists working in lens-based media to better understand the art market and to get their work into galleries. I think that's everything. Thanks again for tuning in. My name's Michael Dooney, and you've been listening to Subtext and Discourse.